So this is a program of Project Drawdowns. As you probably know, if you are here already, Project Drawdown is a nonprofit whose mission is to be really the world's leading resource for science-based climate solutions. There's a lot of confusion out there about how to be the most effective when it comes to addressing climate change. We try to cut through all the noise and all the hoopla and use science and evidence and data to find out what works and what works best to address climate change. Of all the many things we have to do, what are the things that could be most effective? And today, of course, we'll be hearing about food waste, which is one of the most effective solutions we believe to address climate change. Our work is based on three key pillars. We do the science to advance effective science-based solutions. We work with stakeholders, especially investors and philanthropists and business leaders. That's you. Hopefully, all of you in the audience are folks from this community, which we are really excited about. And we also try to tell better stories of people implementing climate solutions, kind of taking the data off the page and into the real world by showing stories of effective action. Today, we're really going to focus on the question of food loss and food waste around the world and why trimming back on this critical issue, trimming back on food waste, can be a powerful climate solution as well as a solution to many other issues like food security, biodiversity, water, etc. And this is part of our ongoing Drawdown Deep Dives session. This is the second one of our so-called deep dives. And we're focusing on what we call the kind of emergency brake climate measures. The climate measures that will be kind of faster than usual, the disproportionately fast climate solutions that could help get us back on track. The first session was focusing on deforestation, but now for the next few deep dives, we're focusing on solutions that touch on things like methane and um, other kinds of issues that can actually dramatically bend the curve on climate change faster than other climate solutions. So that's kind of the idea of these larger sessions. These are high priority climate actions because we're so far behind in where we need to be. Pulling the emergency brakes now is going to be a critical way of catching up and getting back on track. In these sessions, we're going to be kind of giving an overview of the science, looking at the current status and trends and kind of drivers of these possible climate solutions, but also what their barriers may be and what we could do to help accelerate them into the real world, and especially pathways for strategic action by philanthropists, investors, businesses, and so on. So we're going to talk about the science, we're going to talk about the strategy, and we're going to talk about how you all in the private sector can help accelerate these solutions and remove some of the key barriers that we are facing today. What we're hoping for is to really help you catch up to speed very quickly on this critical issue that we're reaching out to business, investor, and philanthropic audiences. And again, we want to spend these sessions really talking about how we unlock and accelerate this critical kind of climate action, whether it's around policy or business innovation and practice, whether it's deploying capital, private investor capital, philanthropic capital, publicly traded money, government funding, you name it, as well as the kind of technical innovations and scientific barriers we face. And most of all, how we face these kind of cultural and behavioral barriers to things like addressing food waste. We'll be looking at all those over the next few sessions and talking to you about how we can work together to unlock these. And we're hoping that you and the audience are part of the community can help us really move these levers of change. Using different kinds of capital in particular, whether it's philanthropic capital, impact, venture, private equity, you name it. We're really interested in seeing how we can deploy resources to drive and support tactics for reducing food waste, this critical emergency brake, and help us address climate change in the process. So that's kind of what we're doing today. We're going to be focusing a lot on the question of food waste, which at one time kind of feels very familiar to all of us. So all we have to do is look at our refrigerators. But at the same time, there's a lot of misunderstanding about where the most important levers are in food loss and food waste and how we can address them together. So I think we're all going to learn a little bit today, and some of it might be surprising. We are doing these kind of drawdown deep dives over the course of this year in partnership with a bunch of great organizations. In particular, today, the ReFed. ReFed, who you'll be hearing from in a few minutes, is a really world-leading nonprofit focusing on food loss, food waste, and what we can do about it. Whenever I hear anybody talk about food waste, I say, you've got to learn about ReFed. It is the best place in town to learn about these issues. And like Drawdown, it focuses on practical solutions. They just go so deep on this issue and are really the world's leading experts on this. So if you have any questions about food loss and food waste, ReFed is the place to go. We also provide some partnership here We work in partnership here on the deep dives with two other organizations, Climate Lead, a leading nonprofit that focuses on accelerating powerful climate philanthropy, and Tonic, a network of family offices and impact investors that are trying to deploy private capital in the most effective ways for social and environmental good. So we're really proud to work with ReFed, Climate Lead, and Tonic on these deep dives. And today, I really have the pleasure of introducing my colleague, Dr. Paul West from Project Drawdown. He's going to be kicking off our session today to give kind of a science overview at the global scale of food loss and food waste and kind of where the big levers are in that system. You're in good hands today, folks. Paul is a world-leading ecologist and a brilliant scientist, thinker, and communicator. Paul got his doctorate at the University of Wisconsin as an ecologist, and then worked for many years with the Nature Conservancy, leading very large international programs on rivers and ecosystems around the world, but also here in the United States. He then moved to the University of Minnesota, leading big initiatives on global food security and its relationships to the environment, working with public and private sector partners, scientists, nonprofits, governments all around the world. He's also been with now Drawdown for a few years as one of our senior scientists leading work on climate solutions, but especially climate solutions that touch nature and ecosystems as well as human societies. He's been really pioneering great work on these kind of win-win-win climate solutions that advance climate solutions and solutions for nature and people at the same time. Paul is a real expert in all these issues. He's also one of the top 1% most cited scientists in the world in his fields, and is just a remarkable scientist and somebody we should all listen to. So with that, I will hand it over to Paul West to take it away and to tell us more about global patterns of food waste.
As you mentioned, I'm Paul West. A little bit of housekeeping, I guess, is I'm a person who stutters. So at times it might just take me a bit, but I'll get there. And with that, I will start to share my slides. So let's start out with what is food waste. As John had mentioned, that there is both is food loss and waste, and just a little bit of a separation of the two is if you look across a supply chain from where our food is produced to is where it ends up on our plate. What is considered like a loss of food really is in that uh, upstream area, and then what is wasted is more like what's at the grocery stores and in our refrigerators, our trash bins, etc., as well as at restaurants. Um, and why is this important, and why is it an emergency brake? Um, so as a first thing, as far as why it's important, in places like in the US and Europe, Australia, it really is more of a waste issue. But in a number of places in the world, in particular areas where there is lower income uh, and high rates of of hunger, there it's more of a food loss issue, and then as a result of that, it's more of a food security issue there, as opposed to more like in the US, where again it's mostly a waste issue. And if you look at the agricultural, like our system as a whole, if you're looking at like where our food is produced, and what is produced and how it is produced. About a quarter of all the emissions on the planet are from our food system, and oftentimes that isn't as well known. So it's more than or than like all of the planes, trains, and automobiles on the planet as far as the emissions. And unfortunately, about a third or so of what is produced in the fields is either is lost or it's wasted. And Refed and others have estimated that, like in the US, that's about the equivalent of 400 pounds of food each year. And so when we think about like our food system and the amount of food waste, um, one thing that oftentimes it comes up as far as an idea for a solution is taking all of our waste and composting it. And while that is a solution, the amount of emissions from what ends up in the landfills is about is 2 or 3% of the overall emissions on the planet. So if you look at the combination of landfills and wastewater, that is 4%, and landfills are about half or a little more of that. So it's important, but it's a small-ish part of all the emissions. But it's still super important, and that is because what ends up in the landfills, what is going in there as organic matter, and it breaks down, what is released is methane. So, and it is only in the atmosphere for a short amount of time. So in that time, it packs a huge punch. So having a focus on reducing the amount of food loss and waste has a big impact on our wallets, our economy, and certainly our climate. So what I'm showing here is that most of the impact of our our food system is happening upstream. So as far as looking at a range of solutions, say if it's composting, that's more of a recycling issue. So to have the most impact, we have to focus on prevention and reuse. In my talk, I'm mainly going to be have a focus on prevention. And Refed is the expert on both that and on reuse. So I mentioned that the amount of food waste is a small-ish amount of emissions as compared to all the emissions from agriculture in general. So as a result of that, when we are thinking about food waste, we have to think about the whole system. So from what happens on the farm, what ends up on our plate, and what eventually ends up in a landfill. So I showed that there's a small piece of emissions in industry that is from landfills, but the actual large impact of the food system really happens um, on the farms. So if in conversations, the a common narrative is that a lot of the impact of food happens as a result of food miles or the packaging, or whether it is conventional or it's organic or if it's GMOs. But if you look at the data, you find that most of the emissions are from where our food is grown. So how much land is cleared, which is still happening around the world and mainly in the tropics, how much land is cleared for more agricultural land. Then uh, our cattle and goats and sheep, when they are eating, they end up as part of processing all their food is burp a lot, and those burps are methane. And then is the impact of how land is managed. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail here. So when we are looking at the impacts of where our food is produced, um, so I was saying before is that across the tropics is that there is still a lot of clearing for more agriculture. So this is a slide from our colleagues at WRI, where they have this ongoing analysis of updating what are the drivers of deforestation. And those areas that you see in orange and yellow are areas that in the last uh, uh, in the last uh, 25 years where forests have been cleared and now are used for agriculture. Again, that's the orange and the yellow areas. So other things are the what. So if you look at the impacts of cattle, that's about is 5% of all the emissions on the planet. And as I said before, it's a result of as they are 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 digesting all their food that you end up with a lot of burping, which is methane. And lastly, if you look at which is a similar amount to methane, if you look at it in total, um, how we are managing our soils, irrigation and fertilizer, that also has an impact. So again, it's fertilizer, irrigation, um, and burning of fuels or of fields after after a harvest. So a second area that I want to talk about is what is wasted uh, matters a lot. So certainly all food waste is bad, but some foods have more of an impact than others, and that's a result of the of where it's grown and what is produced and how it's produced that I shared in the previous slides. So what you are seeing here is those are the bars with the longer length have more of an impact for each pound or kilogram of food. And you see that most of the emissions come from is meat and dairy, um, and what certainly has an outsized impact is beef. So for a next couple of slides, I'm going to have us play a little game, or I'm going to share a story of looking at if you have, say, a half pound of burger. Let's look at what else it could fit in the bag with the same amount of impact on climate. So what you find is that if you're having like it's bread and olives and cheese, it's uh, it's more weight in terms of mass, but in terms of impact on climate, it's it's still a lot smaller. And then if you look at it and you add a couple of pounds of broccoli and carrots, a pound of tofu, a couple of potatoes and veggies, and rice, you still have way more in terms of weight, but only about half the amount of impact on climate as a burger. So you might say, well, yeah, I like cheese and tofu, maybe, maybe not. I like it, but um, and so if someone says, well, all that's nice, but um, I want some meat. So if you add, say, a pound of salmon, you add another, amount of weight, but still just a small amount in terms of impact on climate. And then if you say, no, 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 I don't like fish. I want chicken. Well, if you add a pound of chicken on, you still have a smaller impact on climate. And then, it's nice to also have a little fruit or some wine, and you still have enough left over a carbon budget for a couple of cups of coffee, and a little bit of chocolate as well. So in this next section, I'm going to show like where is waste, is it happening around the world? So here I'm going to show a number of maps. First, though, is to look at that in some places in the world, as I mentioned early on, is that so if you look across a supply chain and regions of the world, that can help you understand which climate solutions or waste solutions are most impactful in different places. So if you look at like in North America, Europe, and parts of Asia, most of the waste is happening at the consumer end. So a redistribution of food is a very impactful solution there. But if you're looking at other places in the world, and again, it's largely where the uh, prevalence of hunger is a lot higher, most of what is lost in the system is in storage or still on the field as a result of pests, say, or rodents. So knowing that, we can start to look at and see that most of the impact from food waste, and this is globally, happen in a few set of countries. So if you look at landfills, our colleagues at Trace have assembled information on all the landfills of the world, or at least is 9,625 of them. Um, and then we looked at the numbers a little bit, and we saw that, a small number of landfills really have an outsized impact. And so while it's important to do like efforts everywhere, there are a handful of areas that really have a high impact. And just as a side note, our colleagues at uh, Industrious Labs recently had a report that a handful of small changes in policies and management of landfills could is cut the amount of emissions in half from all of our landfills in the US. So if you look at how much is wasted, around the world, as I mentioned early on, is that about a third of all the food as a global average is wasted. But certainly there are hotspots of how much of our food is wasted. Um, and you'll see like even in areas like in in India, has a large population, or the biggest on the planet, that the amount of wasted is really small. The other extreme is like in the US. And then if you look at it in terms of how much emissions for each individual, it's oh, that is wasted. So if you look at it in terms of, well, how does that amount of waste it turn into emissions? Um, you can then start to see an impact in terms of climate and not just amount of food. Um, So, like, if you're looking at, well, how much impact on the climate for each person, what we find is that in the US, it's about 30% of all the emissions from our food system in the US. And that's important to note that it's equivalent of because some of the emissions are happening elsewhere, and then they are imported into the US, but it has a very large impact. So a question then is, well, how much of all that's wasted is is beef? Because as I shared before, really has an outsized impact. So if you look at all the emissions for each country, what this map is showing here is how much of those emissions are explained by the amount of beef that is wasted. And so here's an example of a small or a small shift in either the amount of food that is wasted or is part of our diet. It can have an outsized impact. Then here's um, a fun fact or a gross fact, I don't know, but there are other ways of looking at this as well. And so, for example, within the US, a very small number of people are eating most of the beef. So if you're looking at like where to have an influence on climate that is related to all our food that's wasted, there's a targeted a group of people that could have this big outsized impact. So as I'm wrapping up here, a couple of things that I mainly mentioned is that most of the impact is upstream of uh, a landfill. So it's how our food is produced, what is produced, um, and where it is produced. Also, I highlighted that what is wasted, that matters a lot. And then also then I highlighted that there's a small set of places around the world that really have an outsized impact. Then I'll close with, I'm sure a number of people have seen this, but is Michael Pollan's excellent, just extremely short. Uh, uh, his food rules, just to add a little bit of nuance to it in the context of waste, is to only buy what you are needing, eat it, and don't waste it. So next, I'm going to hand it off to Alejandro. Eh, uh,
I think, Paul, we're
eh,
going to hand off to Dana.
okay, great. Oh, off to Dana. Sorry. So off to Dana Gunders, and thank you.
Super. Hi, everyone. So nice to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Dana Gunders. I'm the president at ReFed. I have been working on this whole issue of food waste for about 15 years now. And I have to say, I bumped into John Foley early in that. In fact, it was one of his papers, a couple jobs ago for both of us that really inspired some of my work on this. So it's really a treat to be here with you all today. As John mentioned, ReFed is a nonprofit. We are primarily focused in the US and we are entirely dedicated to reducing food loss and waste. We focus on really four angles to do that. The first is providing data and insights on the topic. The second is trying to catalyze more capital into the space and really help that capital find where the innovation and where good matches to place that capital. The third is our business initiatives, and you'll where we work with the food industry. You'll learn more about that today. And then lastly, we try to act as the hub and connector in the space. So we host a big annual summit on the topic, a lot of programming and webinars and networks and things like that. So with that, I will dive right in and try to pick up where Paul left off. Thank you so much, Paul, for that introduction to the topic. It's always fun to hear how somebody else characterizes it. Right, and I will focus primarily here in the US. which, as you saw from his maps, is a big driver of waste. So in the US, we estimate that about 38%, somewhere around a third, 38% of all of the food in our food supply goes uneaten. Approximately $495 billion worth of food. And of course, this is all happening while there are still 47 million Americans who are food insecure. Next slide, please. Um, so the bulk of that, and I will and I'll take just a small moment to talk about our terminology because it's a little bit different than the food loss and waste frame that Paul said. So we look at kind of what is all of the food that is surplus, and we call that surplus food, regardless of if it gets donated, if it gets turned into animal feed, if it gets composted. All of that is surplus food, and then we look at the destinations of where it goes. So if you take everything that goes unsold, uneaten, only about 2% of that is being donated today. About 7% is being recycled into things like animal feed. And then the bulk of it is going to what we call waste destinations. All right, next slide, please. Oh, and if you saw there, it's close to 2% of the US GDP is about the value of all that food. Paul has already covered some of these environmental impacts, and I just want to emphasize it has a huge climate impact, but there are other impacts as well. So the EP estimates that the equivalent of about 16% of US cropland is going to grow food that never gets eaten. That is an area of land the size of California and New York combined, not to mention about 22% of all freshwater use, just to give you a sense. Go to the next slide. And just to double down on something Paul was talking about around methane and landfills, just last year, the EPA came, or I guess maybe it's 23 now, came out with a report that for the first time put a number to just how much of the methane that is coming from landfills is coming from food. And they estimated conservatively that about 58% of all the methane from landfills is coming from food scraps in those landfills. And landfills in the US are about a third, are the third largest source of methane. So it's really significant if you're somebody who's really trying to focus in on methane. These food scraps are a big portion of that. And one of the challenges is that even when landfills get capped, the food often decays before those landfills get capped because it is such a rapidly decaying product. And so that was part of why it's such a big portion, is that it's almost like no matter what the capping rules are, the technology's capturing that methane, they're not put on quickly enough to really catch the methane from the food, which is, a significant problem, and why that prevention side that Paul was talking about is so important. One of the reasons. All right, next slide. And just to make this point, in the US as well, upstream emissions, much larger impact than downstream, even though that methane is even though food scraps are a big part of the methane, for the overall picture, upstream is still a much larger footprint overall. Go ahead. And again, just to think about things beyond climate, there are estimates that if we were to reduce food waste by 50%, it would reduce land use by about an area the size of Arizona. And that is not just, it is rainforests, but it is also land right here in the US. So just in 2022, the WWF estimates that an area of land almost the size of Yellowstone Park was converted from native grasslands to agriculture and cropland. And so, even here at grasslands, it is rainforest, but it's also other lands that are impacted. In addition, we think about biodiversity. So along with those native ecosystems, trying to cut back on food waste can help try to reduce losses to biodiversity and to water use as well. All right, so we have now convinced you all of the problem, and I've found that it tends not to be hard to sort of convince people there's a problem here. And of course, you're all wondering, what do we do about it? So at ReFed, as I mentioned, we really focus on data and insights. And one of the expressions of that, and a place you can find a lot of our analysis, is in a product we call the Refed Insights Engine. This is free and available to everyone. It's actually a combination of 6 different tools that try to break out our data into usable kind of format. So we look at, what is the problem? We analyze solutions. I'll get into that in a moment. We have a directory where you can find different organizations that are working on this, calculate impact. We have a capital tracker where you can see some of the deals that are happening. You'll hear more about that in the next session, not today, not this morning. And then we also have a way to track policies in all of the states in the US. So we'll drop a link in the chat. Feel free to check those tools out. And some of the information I'm about to show you does come from those tools. Go to the next slide, please. Okay, so where is all of this waste happening? I think one of the challenges of food loss and waste is that we talk about it as if it's one problem, but it's actually very different if you're looking at tomatoes that are not harvested on a farm in the US versus a, restaurant in the US that is serving too many potatoes on their breakfast platters versus a market in Africa, right? And so really when we talk about how do we fix food waste, it is a challenge of essentially improving the efficiency and reducing losses for so many different products at so many different stages. And it's really many problems, not just one. And as you can see here, there's waste happening. The residential sector is the largest sector. So that's you and I in our homes, throwing food out in little bits and pieces here and there. But certainly there's a lot on farm, and this farm estimate does not even include animal products. It's really just looking at produce. And so it's probably even bigger. And certainly, it's happening along the way in manufacturing and distribution and food service and in grocery stores. Though actually grocery stores are the smallest portion. Okay, why? So when you step back and think about why, I like to categorize this into sort of 2 different levels of why, right? There's the root causes of why is this happening, and then there's kind of why it looks like it's happening in the more immediate way. So if you really want to peel back the onion, why is this happening? Food is relatively cheap, certainly in the US, and in other developed countries as well. It is a small portion of our budgets in the US. The US has these smallest expenditures per person. So it's the smallest portion of people's budget in the US as compared with any other country. It's also relatively cheap to throw things out, right? Waste fees are not really something that people consider when they're creating their business plan, let's say. It's invisible because we don't measure it, so it's actually pretty challenging to know how much is being wasted. It's dispersed across the food system and across time, so it's often happening in little bits and pieces over time. In the US, it is relatively culturally acceptable. We want to throw a big party, we want to have lots of food available. No one's looking at all the food left over at the end of the party going like, oh, you're not a good host. You have too much food left over, right? In some ways it is disincentivized. Certainly the more food a business sells, the more profit they make. And so that can be a challenge. Kind of when you look at signals across the supply chain. Food safety is driving a lot of it. So there's, so many rules and a lot of food that does get thrown out for the sake of food safety. There's no immediate crisis. And of course, it's just complicated. There are so many different food types, and it's also complicated by the fact that it's a perishable item, and that adds a lot of complication. So those are some of the root causes. Now, if you look more immediately, like what is happening, well, actually the biggest amount of all of the surplus is in trimmings and byproducts. So that's in manufacturing, the potato peels that are coming from French fry production, let's say. And really in any manufacturing plant, you have a lot of trimmings and byproducts that are coming out of that. That's a big volume. Second, excess. This is overproduction. Maybe it's restaurants and catering facilities that make more and have more in the back of the kitchen that never comes out. It's also plate waste. So that's waste on people's plates after food is served in restaurants. That's a big part of it. Food not being harvested. There's an enormous amount of like perfectly edible, nutritious, good fruits and vegetables that are not being harvested off the farm for reasons of variable pricing. There are quality specs. Maybe it's not the right shape, size, or also there are a lot of labor shortages. And that's actually something as we look ahead, with maybe new rules on immigration, that there could be some impacts to labor shortages as well. Food gets spoiled. Sometimes that's because it's over ordered, right? And then it doesn't sell and then it spoils. And then there's an issue around the date labels on food and really a misunderstanding across the country that is driving people to throw food out prematurely, and then also have stores take products off their shelves prematurely as well. So what do we do about this? Paul kind of referenced this in that nice upside down triangle, but really, I like to boil it down to just kind of a similar to in plastics, a reduce, reuse, recycle mentality. So first, let's prevent food from going to waste. Prevent food from being extra in the first place, right? Let's not have that extra food happen. If we do, let's rescue it, get it to people. And if that's not possible, then let's look at recycling solutions. Certainly animal feed is a good one, and also composting and others. Now at ReFed, we have gone pretty deep into an analysis. We have modeled 42 different solutions to food waste. We've identified another 40 or so that we know will help. We just haven't had the data to really analyze them. And we divide those into seven larger categories, which I don't think we'll go into today, but you can find this all on our website. And what we've really found is taking root today. If you go to the next slide, please. Here's some that are really, I would say, just to highlight a few, we're seeing a lot of action and trends in some solutions. So first, of course, technology. AI is having a big influence. It's helping to manage forecasts. So, in any business that's managing a lot of data, a lot of different food products, and trying to predict how much they're selling or they will sell, we've seen AI products really make a big difference in for those businesses in cutting down the extra that is being ordered. Also in kind of more frictionless integration. So things like imaging, where you can track what's happening, track maybe how much is going to waste without having anyone having to do anything, I think has been really effective as well. And we're seeing that pick up. Also monitoring, so at a higher resolution. So, it used to be maybe you knew something about a truckload of product. Well, now there's the ability to really monitor at the pallet level, sometimes at the case level. There are sensors, there are temperature monitors, and all of that information is being combined to help figure out where best to route this product so that it can sell and within a good shelf life. And so we're seeing things in that category pick up as well. At the consumer level, you may have heard about these kind of kitchen dehydrator products that take your scraps and kind of grind them, dehydrate them, and make it a little bit easier to manage, whether you mix them into your own soil or send them to a compost facility. Intelligent packaging. So, people may not understand date labels, but now there's different approaches at how do we actually indicate on the package via maybe something that's tracking temperature if a product is still good to eat or not. So different ways that intelligent packaging is happening, as well as food management and storage. So, we're seeing some up and coming things around smart Tupperware type of ideas that are interesting. On the business side, certainly upcycling, so taking some of those byproducts and trimmings of trying to find ways to create new food products with that. There are different apps that are helping businesses sell things at the last minute that are taking off. And then just doubling down on best practices. So, it's business is not trying to waste food, right? But sometimes it's those standard operating procedures are just not being met in the way that they want to see. So sometimes it's really just a doubling down on those best practices. Globally, there's a lot of innovation happening at the post-harvest level. So trying to take, you know, supply chains that maybe don't have cold chain or do have a lot of pest issues after a product is harvested, and trying to find a way to provide low cost solutions that can help there. And sometimes that's cold chain and sometimes it's not. So to give you a couple quick examples, one of those in that more global supply chain are these PICS bags. I saw Paul had a picture of these as well. Think of it as like a very fancy Ziploc that can seal and reduce the amount of pests that are getting to, originally it was cowpeas in Africa, and now I think it's a variety of different grains. But just protecting from those pests has reduced pesticide use because they were spraying them on the product before directly. But they've sold, I think, about 50 million of these bags at this point. They estimate they've saved farmers, because farmers are able to hold on to their product longer and get better income. They've saved them about $1.8 billion in like additional revenue they've been able to make because of that, reduced losses, and also the ability to kind of choose when they're selling their product and have a little more time to do that. So that's one example. Another this is an app. It's called Too Good to Go. It helps restaurants to sell a product at the last minute. At the end of the night, you have 6 sandwiches left. You have 8, orders of lasagna. Too Good to Go is an app where you can sell it at a deep discount. This product is now in 17 countries. They estimate they saved about 120 million pounds of food just last year alone. So it's really taken off. Next slide, please. This is, a much less sexy example. This is Compass Group, which is largest food service company in the world, but we're seeing the same thing with Sodexo, Aramark, all of the big food service companies, where they're doing much less sexy things. They're tracking their waste. They're serving, their buffets in smaller bowls. They're trying to offer flexible portions so you can get a baby burrito instead of a big burrito. And all of this seems to be really adding up to work well. There's, one place where Compass estimates they've cut their food waste in half. They're seeing similar results around the world. So that's been positive as well. There's a lot that has to go into these solutions. So of course there's like the direct innovation and that we're seeing, but we also have identified other levers that have impact. Financing is one, and you will hear much more about that in the other sessions. Also, there is policy that is setting the stage for these. And engagement is one that we don't, I think, give as much focus as maybe we should, as sort of the ecosystem working on this, because really at the end of the day, we need people to engage. We need to be engaging this, because this problem is so spread out. It really takes kind of an army of people bought into the problem and thinking about solutions, and or just being willing to take the steps that their supervisors are asking of them, that sort of thing. So that's an area that, we see as a need. Next slide, please. For today, I'm just going to zoom in on policy real quick. Because it is certainly in the US a time of a lot of change. We saw some really exciting action out of the federal government over the past couple of years. We saw record federal funding. Just last year, the government put out a national strategy, and together that has set the agencies up to actually do quite a bit. Now, of course, there's a lot of question marks around what's going to happen with the administration and agency work, but there's a lot about this topic that we believe is actually pretty attractive for the incoming administration. We think it's an effective issue to be working on from the standpoint of a high-priced food environment. And we hear a lot about food prices. Should tariffs happen, we're going to continue to hear a lot about food prices. And it could just be that this is kind of a winning way for the administration to look like they're doing something on that. So we're optimistic that the work will continue. In addition, this is a farm bill year, and so there's a lot of legislative activity that's happening at the federal level, primarily to try to influence what makes it into the farm bill. At the state level, we're seeing a lot of action, and I think, given question marks federally, we'll see more at the state level. Just this past year, we had 100 bills introduced, 18 were passed. One of the biggest ones this year was one that standardized the way date labels on food are done in California, and we believe that will likely have a ripple effect and set some precedents across the country, and maybe even lead to a federal bill to come. Knowing I'm running short on time, I won't go deep in here, but I will say that probably one of the most influential state policies that we're seeing passed are what we call organic waste bans. And so that is laws that restrict food from going into the landfill. And there are 12 states, including DC, that have some kind of restriction on food going to landfill. And typically they're pairing those with funding because they need the funding to build out the infrastructure for where the food will go if it won't be in a landfill. So often that's going to build out composting or anaerobic digestion. Go on. And again, as I said, I think it is a time of change. I think we're going to see more and more state policy happening. We've heard murmurs of some of the satellite data that is now available for methane to potentially be something that eventually we could see policies or regulations linked to at the state level. I think federally, we will see the strategy go ahead, but probably from a funding perspective, it will decrease. And I'm just, you can move on from there. Because I want to make sure you have a chance to hear from my colleague Jackie Suggett on the business environment. I think just to leave you with a few thoughts on broader trends right now that we're also tracking. One, of course, is AI, and what is that going to mean for all of the different potential? I think generally speaking, AI is going to be very positive for this topic. The other are GLP-1 drugs. And so those are the Ozempics that we're seeing, and we're seeing a lot of change in the food industry because there's this new demand for smaller portions, for fresher foods. Over 8 million Americans are taking those drugs right now, and it's like quite a tidal wave of disruption for the food industry that we think could have kind of positive and negative impacts on the waste topic. With that, I will pass it on to Jackie to talk a little bit more about the business environment and what we're seeing there.
Thanks, Dana, and thanks for the invite to be here. I'm really happy to join you all. By way of very quick introduction, my name is Jackie Suggett. I'm the Vice President of Business Initiatives and Community Engagement at ReFed. So a lot of the work Dana talked about in her intro, both one-on-one engagements with food businesses, as well as a lot of the collaborative partnerships that we help facilitate here in the US. And before I even dive into some of the content, I think at the highest level, I want to kick off this section acknowledging that by their very nature, food businesses are motivated to address waste. Waste is by definition an inefficiency. Inefficiencies are a cost, and so there is inherent motivation to do something about it. That being said, the business environment, as we'll talk through, is very complex. So there are competing priorities. There are heavily siloed supply chains and nodes within the supply chain. There are regulatory barriers, and honestly, a lot of just not knowing what to do, right? What's the next step after we've done perhaps the low-hanging fruit? So we'll talk through a little bit of that today, but at the highest level, I'd say that's part of the key message going into this. But let's start with that systemic problem. I talk about food waste being systemic in nature. That's a simple phrase. I actually mean several different things when I say that. The first is that it does in fact happen throughout the entire food system from farm to fork. The second Dana already referenced, which is that a head of broccoli that I throw away because I forgot about it in my fridge is very different than a head of broccoli that goes to waste on farm in terms of cost, cause, and solution. The third, though, is that it is not as simple as identifying where within the system food waste happens. So there's a very neat number here attached to farm, 17.5 million tons. However, food waste that happens on farm is not necessarily because of policies, decisions, and behaviors that happen on farm. It's often because of influences throughout the supply chain. So going back to our broccoli, it may be left in the field, never harvested because of specifications that are set at the retail level. And retailers, at least in part, set specifications based on how you and I spend our dollars within their stores. So that relationship happens in both directions, where policies, decisions, and behaviors at one node heavily influence waste within the other nodes, which is really part of the justification for collaborative solutions across the supply chain on food waste. We can go to the next slide. Momentum is happening there, both within the individual walls of food businesses as well as collaboratively. Businesses within the US and around the world are all making progress voluntarily and collaboratively on this issue. This is one example of that. This represents businesses that are part of either the Pacific Coast Food Waste Commitment and or the US Food Waste Pact, which are two collaborative efforts within the US focused exclusively on food waste reduction. They mirror the Target Measure Act framework that's used globally. So they have all set some level of commitment on reducing food waste. They are all measuring and reporting on food waste reduction. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but to me, public reporting is really kind of the base level of what we should be doing with data. There's so much more we can do. We call it decision-ready data to influence what actions these businesses actually take to reduce waste. Public reporting does not inherently reduce waste. It's good for accountability, but it's not actually a solution itself. And then they're going further and they're taking action. So as I said, they are driving solutions within their own four walls, but one of the core powers of the collaborative effort is connecting and unsiloing the different nodes in the supply chain and getting them to work together. And I'll share a few more examples on that as we go through. I'll also say this model is echoed globally. I actually just got back from a week in Mexico City where we met with our peers in 10 different countries who are running similar pre-competitive partnerships focused on food waste in the private sector. So this model really is happening around the world. And progress is happening. So this is a couple examples of where we're seeing progress. The chart on the left comes from an annual report from the Pacific Coast Food Waste Commitment in the US. And it shows that over this 4-year period, we are seeing a 28% reduction in unsold food. We're also at the same time seeing over 20% increases in composting rates and donation rates. So even though there's less food to get rid of, they're still getting rid of it in the right places more often. A lot of that we have to attribute to not necessarily explicit business behaviors, but just the environment at large. These were COVID years. These were years of heavy inflation on food prices, both of which, and this is retail data, I should clarify. So both of those in a retail setting definitely supported the reduction in unsold food. But there's also progress happening because of very specific behaviors. And we know that because of the right half of this slide, which are specific examples where we're seeing solutions being implemented and scaled throughout the private sector. Again, these come from that list of companies you saw on the previous slide, either on the West Coast or nationally in the US, who have run almost 20 different pilot projects or scaled pilot projects over the last couple of years. So a few that I'll speak to here that are listed, we are seeing AI ordering software being implemented and having notable reductions per store. In addition to the food waste reductions, we're seeing that software pay for itself with other efficiencies within that store environment. Dana already mentioned upcycling. That's we also talk about as in-store repurposing. I think what's most interesting here is we're seeing net new sales, so new products that are driving revenue for the stores without cannibalizing the products that they're coming from. So for example, a rotisserie chicken turned into a chicken salad, they're actually still selling at least as many rotisserie chickens within their stores. likely because of perceived freshness of that product. Employee engagement is a huge trend right now. This is personally one of my favorites. It falls in the less sexy category that we've been talking about, but these are low tech, low cost solutions that are coming from frontline employees in their sphere of influence. And within that sphere of influence, we're seeing really significant reductions in waste, and that the 53 to 74% range. So this is a really exciting area for me. And then finally, we're diving deep into commodities. So we're saying, okay, let's tackle strawberries. Let's look at that entire supply chain and try and figure out what is actually happening within that supply chain that we might be missing when we look within an individual sector. So as one highlight from a recent study, we found that 25% of the strawberries that do go to waste on farm are in fact edible. They're just not marketable. So going beyond those specific examples, trying to summarize, maybe level up what some of those key strategies are leading to waste reduction, I'll pull out 4. I think we could name several more. The first is engaging the supply chain. So actually starting where I left off on the last slide, we're seeing a lot of businesses who are done with the low-hanging fruit or the stuff they can immediately control within their own environments, looking to have more complex relationships throughout the supply chain and to partner with their suppliers to understand, again, where that waste is happening and how they can work together on solutions. So going back to my strawberry example, where 25% of what's left behind is edible, that's not a farmer's problem to solve on their own because they don't have a market for it. So we're actually seeing specific examples of upstream and downstream players coming together and finding new market channels for those strawberries. Frontline workers, I want to call out the word empowering here, not educating. I think educating is part of empowering, but we have to go beyond that and actually incorporate them into identification of the solutions. As I mentioned, these are often low-cost, low-tech solutions, but they're also solutions that would never come up in a CEO roundtable. These are things very specific within those manufacturing lines or other areas where frontline workers are engaging, but seeing really heavy impacts. The third is data. Measurement and analytical tools, including our own, are becoming a lot more sophisticated. So we're actually able to go beyond public reporting, as I mentioned, and get into decision-ready data. And what I mean by that is we can look at specific data within a business and say, okay, based on what we know about what's happening within your business, we can actually reprioritize the 42 solutions that Dana referenced based on what's going to have the highest ROI for your business. So really what's informing strategy and accelerating the adoption of solutions. And then finally, leaning in on technology. Dana gave a few really great examples of this. And so I'll leave it there for now and kind of throw your mind back to some of the examples that she gave in her presentation. There are obviously still challenges. I don't like ending on challenges, but I do want to walk through just kind of some of the realistic issues that are still making it hard to make progress on food waste. And then we can certainly come back and talk about solutions to these in the Q&A or other trends that we're seeing. But if you all highlight one, competing priorities, behaviors and policies that reduce food waste can conflict with business, like standard business practices or other sustainability initiatives. What I mean by that, just as an example, plastic packaging often comes up in conversations on food waste because packaging extends shelf life. So what is the trade-off there? Or another thing we're seeing right now is businesses that are bringing in like cut fruit programs in-house because it's fresher. It gives them a longer shelf life within the store and it increases customer satisfaction. It actually drives more waste because it's not done centralized. Another related thing here I'll say is sustainability issues often lack central owners who are also operational and financial decision makers within a business. So that there's some disconnect between decision making and implementation. The business case, sustainability budgets are often very small. So sustainability teams are often having to sell it internally for their own dollars in order to invest in labor or solutions or changes to business practices. Misaligned incentives, the cost and benefit are not often or not always incurred at the same point within the supply chain. So again, talking about packaging or standardized date labeling, the cost is incurred by one business and the benefit is often real or perceived happening later in the supply chain. Delivering customer expectations, we are all customers. Even when we are educated customers, we still like to walk into a store and see a beautiful pyramid of apples or a full buffet. That's a little bit kind of woven into our expectations. So we are driving some of those business practices that are in fact wasteful. There are several solutions out there that can impact these, but legacy practices are really hard to shift within a business environment. And then finally, fresh is messy. Basically, the supply chains for fresh product, meat and produce are highly vulnerable. We have cold chains that can be unpredictable and challenging to manage. But these categories are often have the highest demand for freshness and perceived freshness. So it's a sticky problem and will continue to be. So I'm going to stop there. Certainly a lot more to talk about, but I think, again, core message, businesses want to reduce waste. It is in their best interest to do so because of these challenges and a lot of the other things I've talked about the last few minutes. It is also hard. And so there's prioritization and decision-making and collaboration that needs to happen in order for that change to happen. And with that, I think I'm turning it back to John.
Yeah, thanks everybody. And thanks for the wonderful presentations. Like we get a great overview of kind of food waste is a big issue from Paul and Dana on like the specifics of where the solutions are going to be, and Jackie, the kind of business and private sector kind of opportunities here. So please join me in thanking everyone for their great talks. You can use your little emojis thing or reactions or whatever to send a little thank you or virtual applause for people kindly sharing their kind of expertise. If we could have like Paul and Dana and Jackie back on the screen, possibly, we have time for some Q&A, which my colleagues are synthesizing in a little document here. So I'll just kind of start off. Yeah, if Paul and Dana could go on back on camera too, I'll just kind of pitch some questions to everybody's way. So this one is a question for Dana, I guess, but I think others can chime in as well. Is there an area where technology is really holding back progress, or the lack of good technologies, maybe holding back key progress in reducing food waste? You mentioned things like AI and other stuff. I'm always imagining like a cool sensor in my fridge that tells me when the cheese goes bad. Who's working on this stuff? What's going on?
Yeah. No, it's a really fun topic. We could have a whole session on it. Okay, so if I had a magic wand, the place I would love to see technology that I don't see a lot happening on is in kind of instant food safety detection, actually, right? Because there's a lot of food that gets thrown out kind of in the name of food safety in these broad ways. It has sat out for 4 hours. It has done this, right? And if we could just like dip a thing, wave a magic wand over it and detect that, that would be incredible. So I think the lack of something like that is one.
Like a food tricorder, right? For the Trekkies in the audience, like little thing.
Exactly,
I want one
exactly.
of those. Yeah.
I know. That's one magic one. I think the second would be kind of like ubiquitous measurement, right? So if you got a daily report on your phone of how much food you wasted and what it was and how much you just spent on food that was wasted, right? And if every waste truck had a scale and then reported back to you in the way that happens with energy, would there be something there? So I think those are kind of big areas. And then I think what we're seeing is like there's a lot of there's a lot coming online now, and so there's a lot being piloted that just hasn't really hit scale. So and that's kind of in those like traceability sensors, waste tracking, some of the AI applications, right? It's all happening really fast. Jackie, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, I'll echo the measurement magic wand. That would also be mine. My addition to that would be, I think, from a business perspective, one of the challenges, there are so many different technologies, but they don't service the full issue. And so stitching together different technologies is a really big challenge. So I don't know if that's another technology that stitches them together or not. Maybe we're overcomplicating it there, but I do think that's a challenge in the implementation and use of technology, is having to marry up several different systems to kind of paint that full picture.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really cool. I wish Silicon Valley and tech folks would focus more on sensors and kind of hard tech, not just soft tech. And well, as of this morning, a whole bunch of AI engineers in America will probably be out of work. So I don't know if you've been following the news on this, but the Nasdaq's tanking right now, thanks to a huge disruption from China on AI. So we might just seen a huge sea change in this today. In fact, who knows what's going to happen with that. But yeah, that'd be kind of interesting in the kind of the hard tech of sensors and kind of finding food waste and tracking it, the physical food waste, not just software, but hardware would be really, really interesting too. That's very, very, very cool opportunity. Here's another one also for sent to Dana, but others I'm sure would be really appropriate too. What are some maybe realistic kind of U.S. food waste successes at the national level in terms of like policy issues that if you could have an audience with people in the administration, what would you kind of go for right now? Some people are mentioning things like, nationalized composting, like Germany's doing, other things. But, if you could get a short wish list in front of the federal government today, what would that be?
I mean, a national waste ban would be amazing. That's so far from happening because the jurisdiction for waste tends to be at the state level. And it's a there's a huge funding need that goes along with banning food from waste, right? Like you got to build where it goes. And so it's an infrastructure challenge. And so while that is a dream, I don't think it is a likelihood in this administration. I think much more likely is standardizing the date labels on food, which is a wonky kind of thing to go into, but I think it is a foundation we need to set. The other thing I'm interested in is portion sizes right now, and I'm curious about if there is a role for the government to play there from a policy standpoint, because so much food is being wasted on people's plates that is not getting eaten, right? And so um are there ways, there were calorie counts posted, does that help? Or, I see things like, could we require restaurants to just illustrate, give a visual representation of how big portions are before people order so that they can and maybe to have, if everyone had to have an option of everyone has to allow for half orders, let's say, or something like that. Would that actually go a certain ways on the plate waste issue?
Yeah, absolutely. And portion sizes and things too, of course. This is a question probably best for Paul, but others too to chime in, of course, too. This is pretty free flowing here. But Paul, I love the graphic of the table where you should like, here's a here's a hamburger and here's a giant pile of groceries, and they end up having the same greenhouse gas emissions. The kind of disproportionate effect of certain kinds of food, that not all food or food waste by analogy is created equal. It's astonishing to most people that 1 pound of beef creates 100 pounds of greenhouse gas to produce it, far above about anything else other than lamb, which is about the same. So, lamb and beef are super polluter kind of foods, unfortunately, even though they're tasty. I love them personally, but we got to address this. But getting back to the point, I guess, is linking diets and food waste together, that maybe it's been hard to get people to shift away from heavy meat diets has been a really tough go. But maybe one way to get people to be more mindful of their beef consumption is talking about how food waste of beef is so important. And, it's also the benefits to people's pocketbooks and just that kind of, ethic of like, hey, it's really precious to have a pound of beef. Let's make sure not to waste it. Do you see any opportunities there of kind of linking the kind of the dietary and food waste kind of messaging better to kind of have a different way of talking about kind of the heavy nature of beef in our diets?
Yeah, I like that question a lot, and I think your idea of of being more like explicit about a food waste message, and really highlighting that there are a certain set of foods that that have a outsized impact. As far as diet, as I'm sure everybody on the call knows, it's it's such a part of who we are and our culture, and that's not even just across a number of countries. I'm in the Midwest, and what people eat here is a lot different than what others are eating in California or in New York City. At least on first order, at least as far as like the amount of beef and the amount uh, of vegetables, which AKA is a potato in the Midwest. But I think that is the key part. And what has been shown is that in many times you don't necessarily need to shift sort of what's on the plate as much as Dana was saying, is change a portion size, and that's either like a plate as a whole, or how much of what's on the plate is veggies and grains, or meat or dairy. That's one thing. Then there's some like at universities. One I know of is at Stanford. Uh, and Google has done this as well. From what I understand, is like in the cafeterias, they have moved away from having a tray that allows you to have a whole bunch of plates and a whole bunch of drinks to as you fill up your plate and you go and eat, and if you want to come back, that's great. But they have found that shift alone has had a big impact on the amount of waste. And then at a number of hospitals, they have done, I guess, a number of studies that have shown that if there are more healthy options on the menu or on the board, that is eaten more than if there's just a single option. So
Yeah, cool. These behavioral nudges and such too are really, really important. I think Dana
Maybe
wants
I
to
can
chime
jump in here, John. Yeah, just, I mean, I think we get asked that question a lot, is like, can we target waste reduction to these higher footprint products, right? Can we start with reducing waste in beef and dairy first? And I think the answer is like, sort of. The further down the supply chain you get, the harder that gets. So if you're up in, looking at traceability and where you're applying those sensors, yes, you can try to work through your beef supply chain first, right? And make sure there's not like a load of beef getting wasted at a port in Brazil or something like that. And that is, I think, because it's higher value product, what's happening anyways is like, as these technologies become available, it makes sense to apply them to the higher value products, which beef is one of. As you get further down the supply chain, it gets more complicated, right? It's, if you're working with a restaurant, they're not only going to do something just on their beef, right? If they're going to do something on portions, they're going to do it more broadly. So I think in that sense, at that sort of consumer facing level and at the consumer level, it's really more of like the writ large work on food waste helps on those products and other products too.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I mean, maybe following along this line too, and I'd love to hear what Jackie's thoughts on this too, in terms of like the investment and business case as well, but just kind of a free for all. Again, such a ubiquitous problem of food loss and waste from, the farm to the fork to the fill and everything in between, and across all these different commodities. In our work at Drawdown, we always look at these big ubiquitous landscapes of what we have to do and try to find these kind of leverage points, like where are the points in a supply chain, which commodities, which geographies, which practices do we pull first? We can't do everything at the same time. We can't boil the ocean instantly. So we gotta pick something. So I appreciate what you're saying, Dana. Sometimes that's really hard. But are there opportunities that are limited by capital right now? Like, wow, if we just put money here, that would be that would be disproportionately effective to reducing food loss and waste by focusing on, these things in this commodity from this practice in these states or countries or whatever. I think we're all kind of hungry for that. How do we take a big, oh my God list of things we've got to do to oh, okay, here's the first five. I can bite off that, and then there's the next five and the ones after that. Where are the kind of leverage points here from a kind of capital perspective, like where investors and philanthropists, some of whom are on this call, and I know we'll talk more about that in other sessions, but just as a teaser for that, are there particular kind of low-hanging fruits that, oh, wow, if somebody just put a few tens of millions here, we could make a huge difference. This is, wildly underinvested in and a great opportunity. What are some of those?
Dana, do you want to start or do you want me to jump in with a couple. Okay, yeah, I'll maybe two immediately come to mind. I'm sure more would come if I think about it. One, I think, is going back to the business landscape in particular. There's a lot of fear to jump in both feet immediately into new solutions, right? So I think de-risking, especially like technology solutions or high cost solutions or infrastructure-based solutions for food businesses goes a long way. You're talking about some businesses that have thousands and thousands of stores. And so the risk of getting it wrong, or the reason they pilot for years, is because that risk is there. So I think de-risking some higher cost solutions in the business sector. The other one I'll mention, came up in my presentation a little bit. It's where nodes in the supply chain connect. We sometimes lose the ability to address food waste there, right? Because it's not immediately in the ownership of one of those two parties. So going back to my strawberry example, between that coming off the farm and getting into a food service or retailer's hands can be really complicated. As an example, in strawberries, one of the solutions that they look at is actually bulk harvesting and sorting of those strawberries off-site. But that's new infrastructure. Who pays for that, right? It's shared infrastructure between growers and processors, between processors and retailers. So there are certain solutions that span and need to be shared costs or need creative funding solutions in order for them to succeed.
Very, very cool. Dana, you want to add to that? Paul, too?
Well, I would echo what she said. I think she's spot on. And but just to emphasize, I think we do see like a little reluctance when businesses are involved, right? People are like, well, they're going to save the money. They should be paying for it. And so I think there's this a little bit of a mismatch in both attitude and budget, because yes, while, big food company X could pay for that, the person who's in charge of implementing that and their budget will not always like cover it. And so that de-risking, that shared cost, like that actually can play a pretty important role. And I think where that plays a role is in the scaling. And I think it's a really good time right now to be looking at scaling. There's a lot of pilots that have happened. We know things that are working. And I think it is that scaling that is kind of a good focus area right now.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, we have just a couple of minutes before we close off. Maybe I'll just invite the three of you to share any last thoughts you have about, like, if you had one key take-home point that you'd like people to remember from this work, what would that be? Maybe we start with we'll go in the order of presentation. So maybe start with you, Paul, and then Dana, and then Jackie. So how about, a little unfair to spring this on you, sorry, but is there kind of one take-home point that you wanted to bring to everybody today?
Yeah, as far as one, I'm gonna have three, but extremely short. In my talk, I emphasize that most of the impact of food waste, it happens upstream, and usually on the farm. And second is what is wasted matters a lot. And third, that there are a small number of places or demographics where you have an outsized impact if you are focused there.
Yeah, Dana? Yeah.
I think my takeaway would be, I think we just threw a lot at everyone. And what I neglected to mention is that that we host, and we threw a lot at everyone, and it can be hard to figure out exactly where to go. One thing that we do at ReFed is we host a food waste funder circle that actually tries to do a lot to kind of, help people figure out exactly what the right fit is via, we sort of circulate funding opportunities, we hold some educational programming, we hold some networking, there's individual advisory calls that they do. So if you're interested in this, please come join this funder circle. It's free. And we'll help you peel the layers back on the onion, because we know that it is a lot we just threw at you.
Jackie?
And at the risk of sounding naively idealistic, I think my takeaway is, like, we truly are all in this together. No one wakes up wanting to waste food, and there is an action that everyone can take, either as a consumer or in our professional roles to do that. And so much of it is about having the right conversation with the right person, de-risking the solutions, collaborating with people outside of our normal spheres of influence. But I hope that's come across in the presentation today, is that I hope no one is walking away thinking there's nothing I can do about this. That should not be the case.
Can I add one more, John?
Sure.
So, if this is a new topic for you, you're gonna like go out back into your normal life, and you're gonna see a lot of extra food out there, and you're gonna want to just kind of eat it. And so I just want to tell you that is not the way to solve food waste. It's the way to gain waste, actually, the other kind of waste. So just, think of this as a systems problem, and it's something you kind of need to think about before the waste happens, right? Not when it's sitting there. So don't go eat it all.
Yeah, don't trade one form of food waste to another kind of waste down here. Yeah. So yeah, love that. I
Yeah.
also might suggest, my wife and I often argue about what the dates on the food mean. She's one of those people like, oh my God, it's 1 hour past the date, throw it out. And I'm like, no, no, no. So
Send her to me, John. Send her
if you
to
need
me.
marriage counseling for that, whatever.
I got you. I got you. I've saved a
Oh,
lot of
you got
marriage.
that. Okay, cool. All right, well, let's hand it back to Hannah to round us out, and I'll pass the baton back to Hannah for a closing.
Thank you, John, and thank you to all of our speakers for sharing their time and expertise with us today. That was amazing. And as a reminder, this is the first of 3 sessions. So we shared this in chat earlier, but in case you need it, later tonight is the global session. And so a lot of the same content you heard today, but with a greater emphasis on global perspectives and global opportunities. And then tomorrow will be the capital focus session, which is a great second session to this one. And we highly recommend that. So hopefully my team can put that again in the chat if you need to register, but would love to have you join us again. And then as to other next steps, stay tuned for the recording and more resources. We'll be sending that along, and feel free to share any comments or any feedback. In the meantime, would love to hear from you, especially if you find yourself taking an action as a result of this deep dive. It's very helpful for our team to understand the impacts of these events. So thank you so much, everyone, and see some of you tonight or tomorrow.